Charlie Kirk is that he talked about the fact that as he talked about the fruits of the Spirit, he said one of the fruits of the Spirit is self-control. And he says, and you have to understand that often I know that I didn't exercise self-control. And he said, there are words that I wish that I could have taken back that I said. And that's the problem when everything's recorded and everything's thrown out into the public sphere. You do have things that you say that can cause an awful lot of issue. My wife has said to me, I think that it would be an interesting thing if you went into politics. And I said to her, do you know what? It would take next to no time for people to take some portion of my words, to encase them, and to make me a monster. They would be quite capable of doing that in a short period of time, because that's what adversarial people driven by the adversary do. They make monsters out of people that aren't saying monstrous things. So that was one thing I appreciated, his statement about the fact that he wished in some cases that he had been able to show that he had measured his words more carefully. He says there's words that I would like to have taken back. And one of the other things that he said that I thought was really good was because he was asked in one situation, why do you go into these adversarial settings you go into, where basically you can have a crowd kind of coming at you and you're arguing with them. And he said, I do that because, he said, when people stop talking, bad things happen. He said, when couples stop talking, marriages end in divorce. He said, when people on both sides of a political spectrum stop talking, it turns into violence and civil war. And he said, and so I talk in order to prevent things turning into violence. And I thought, that's an interesting statement, and that is true. When people refuse to talk to each other and have important and good conversations together, the next step very often is that we dehumanize each other and we treat each other as less than. And I think that's not a bad thing for us to understand. But anyway, that's the end of what I'm going to say on this. I have a mental challenge for you as we come into Matthew chapter 5 and as we take a look at the Beatitudes. And probably we could turn this into a big discussion. And yeah, but I have a mental challenge for you as we take a look in the Beatitudes. And I want to read them for you really quickly because I think it's just a good thing for us to look at the whole of these. And this is something that if you were looking for something to do in your own devotional time privately, I will tell you that what you could do is you could spend a long time in the Beatitudes, just one verse at a time, and taking and carefully meditating about that verse in the course of a day, saying, what does this mean? What does this mean for me? What does this mean for who I should be as I follow Christ? And it says in Matthew chapter 5, verse 3, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you, and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Now, I want to give you a bit of a mental challenge right now as we read through this. Bible scholars have always recognized that Matthew portrays Jesus as the fulfillment of Moses' prophecy. Jesus is the greater Moses. In fact, Deuteronomy chapter 18, Moses says there's going to be somebody who comes after me who is like me, and you will need to listen to him. And Moses was understood as the great lawgiver, the one through whom God gave his covenant. And so we see that Matthew portrays Jesus as the fulfillment of Jesus' prophecy, and Jesus deliberately acts in a way to show that he is the new and greater Moses. In fact, if you go to the book of Hebrews, Hebrews really develops this idea of Jesus as the new and greater Moses. Hebrews is all about, if you remember, going back into the Old Covenant and saying, okay, what does it mean? And if you want to sound like you know what Hebrews is saying, and somebody says, what's Hebrews about? You say to them, Hebrews presents Jesus, the high priest of a new and better covenant. And when you say that, you will basically have, and some of you are smiling because you remember me going back over and over and over that theme on Sunday nights years ago when I taught through the book of Hebrews. Jesus Christ, the high priest of a new and better covenant. But when we see this, here's my question. In what ways does Jesus make the connection in our minds between Moses and the giving of Old Covenant law and this giving here of the fuller teaching that we read from chapters 5 through 8? Okay? So chapters 5 through 8 here in Matthew. In what ways does Jesus make the connection in our minds between Moses when he gave the Old Covenant law and himself? Now this is going to be, as I said, it's a mental challenge. I want you to think about this, and I am presuming some degree of knowledge and of thinking in this particular area, but I'll give you a few. But can anybody give me any ways in which he made the connections in people's minds? Yes. Right? Okay. So one thing that happens is, and we're doing these out of order, but one thing that happens is that Jesus Christ says again and again, once we get past the Beatitudes, he will say, "You have heard it said that, but I say to you." And so what he does is he keeps going into the law and the Old Covenant interpretations of the law, and he keeps saying, "You have heard it said that," and then he says, "But here is the heart of the law. Here is the heart of what God gave to Israel." Okay, so he does that over and over and over again in the chapters that follow. Well, once we get past chapter 5, verse 17, he spends his time doing that. Okay, what else? Setting. Pardon? Teaching on a mountain. What happened for Old Covenant law? Tell me what happened. Pardon? Yeah, Moses went up a mountain and he came down a mountain. A mountain was named Sinai. And what happened for the people? Could they go up on the mountain with him? What did Jesus do? Jesus went up a mountain and he said, "Come with me." Now that's an interesting thing. That's an interesting thing when you think about the fact that as we see Jesus raised from the dead, what happens at the point of Jesus' resurrection from the dead? Because this is a new covenant teaching over and over again. At the point that Jesus is resurrected, at the point that Jesus dies, what happens when Jesus dies in the temple? Pardon? Curtains ripped from top to bottom. What's the message in that? Pardon? God, you can come to God. So the interesting thing, we take a look, Jesus goes up a mountain as Moses went up a mountain. The difference is the people can't go up the mountain with Moses. The law comes back down to them. But Jesus says, come up the mountain to me, and I will teach you. And so we have this. What else? So we've got setting, we've got the whole issue of what happens as far as the appendix. And this is the thing for us to think about when we take a look at the law. The law is, we see 10 commandments, and then we see 613 in total appendixes that follow on that, as far as the working out of those 10 commandments in day to day. What do we see here? Do we get 10 commandments? Okay. Think about the structure of what we look at here. What happens first? What are we going to spend our time looking at? Okay. If you are. Okay. And I think that thou shalt not compared to this is who you are to be. We get 9 short statements here, and then we get the expansion of what those statements mean in practical life. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, it's looking for, when you say sanctification, what you're talking about ultimately is the fact of the change of the whole person, right? So what we have is we have the structure that is given. We see 10 commandments given, and then we see those 10 commandments explained with a whole pile, hundreds of appendices, saying this is what this is going to look like in the practical living out of it. Here we get 9 short statements, and then we get a whole bunch of appendices saying, and this is what it's going to look like in the practical living out of this. Jesus is the new Moses. He invites people up onto the mountain where he gives them the new covenant explanation of what it means to be a kingdom citizen. He takes, and what he does is he gives them 9 pithy statements. Some people even say of this that it's actually 10 statements, but I'm kind of inclined to struggle with that as far as structure. But 9 pithy statements, and then the expansion of it, just like Moses gave 10 statements, and then the expansion of it. So it's up on a mountain, Sinai versus this mountain. It's short sayings at the start, the summary and the essence of the whole that's going to follow. 10 commandments in the old covenant, what to do, written on stone, versus the 9 beatitudes of the new covenant, which is not what to do, but who to be. And this is, as we think about what Jeremiah says, Jeremiah talks about the fact that the law of the new covenant would be written on people's hearts. It's not going to be stone tablets anymore. It's going to be who to be. It's what's written on our hearts. And then we see the appendix, the expansion, the application to follow. After the 10 commandments, we have all these case law explanations through the rest of what's written. Explanations of how that looks in day-to-day life. How to live as a citizen in the kingdom of Israel. Here, after the 9 Beatitudes, we get a prolonged explanation of what the fulfilled law looks like in its heart essence. In other words, how to live as a citizen in the kingdom of heaven. One was, how do you live as a citizen in the physical kingdom of Israel? This one is, how do you live as a spiritual citizen in the spiritual kingdom of heaven? And then as we follow through on that, and as we take a look at what happens, you'll notice that at the end of these 9 statements, we have as our hinge verse, because he gives the 9 statements, and then he says, this is going to be the impact if you live these out. You will be salt, and you will be light. And then he goes on, and here's the hinge that moves to his explanation. In chapter 5, verse 17, we read this. "Do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill." So he says this is the hinge. I am the fulfillment of what God was first giving Israel, what he was revealing to them in part. And then he goes on, and after he says, I've come to fulfill the law, he spends a whole bunch of time saying, you've heard that the law is this. And basically what he does is he points to a very wooden letter of the law, explanation of the law. People's view of the law saying, how can I use the law to get away with as much as I want? And he says, you've heard the law explained in this way, but this is what I say to you is the essence and heart of it. This is what's supposed to drive it. And so ultimately, as Tom said, Jesus says that the whole law is fulfilled in this. You will love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, all your strength, and you'll love your neighbor as yourself. So our approach to the commands of God is not how do I do the minimum so that I can say that I'm keeping them, but get away with what I want to get away with and do to people what I want to do to people. He said, it's the maximum. How do I understand the law as how I will love other people? How I will give the wholeness of who I can be to those other people. And this is I think really important for us to understand. So we're thinking here about who Jesus calls us to be as citizens of the kingdom of heaven in the new covenant. This is who we are internally, lived out in our lives so that the beauty of God's kingdom is seen by a broken world and proclaimed to it, so that we are actually salt in a broken world. You think of how many times Christians or people under the name of Christianity or in the name of Christ have been jerks. And as Christians have done things wrong because of the fact that what's happened is we maybe have gotten law by the letter pretty good, but we don't get the spirit and essence of it right, then people end up taking a look and we are not salt and we are not light. But when believers get the heart of what God teaches us right, yes, evil will still hate it. But in many cases, for those who are hungry, for those who are scared, people living out Jesus Christ will be seen as there is something beautiful here. There is salt. There is light. And so we see that the world is broken. And this is about who we are internally, lived out in our lives, so that the beauty of God's kingdom is seen by a broken world, and the beauty of God's kingdom is declared to a broken world. We see that the world is broken, and we see the failures of human wisdom and the failures of human approaches to fix it. In fact, often human approaches break it worse, and people worse. And this is what happens when we try to determine right and wrong and good and evil from our own standards. The result is chaos. But Jesus goes through here and he's explaining who will be blessed, who actually is living like a citizen of the kingdom, what it looks like for us to be people who are citizens of the heavenly kingdom. And he explains, he uses the word blessed, and when he uses that word blessed, think about that word as meaning something like supremely fortunate, or under God's favor, or to be congratulated. To be congratulated are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Under God's special favor are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Zeth said last week, he talked about the fact that this is the upside down kingdom that we're looking at. And it is. There's an upside down perspective here. But we can see why this upside down kingdom makes things better if we stop and we think about a world that was made by a truly good God. We can see why this would transform. You guys are laughing because I just basically haven't gotten past the introduction at this point. But I wanted to take a little bit of time, and I want us to think about the nature of this. And the first thing that we read is that we're poor in spirit. Okay. Blessed are the poor in spirit. And I want to ask you to tell me right off, what do you think this means? Because it's a strange phrase to us. What does it mean, blessed are the poor in spirit? Yes, David. Okay. So we're needy. We need God's Spirit. Okay. Yes, Tara. Okay, no hope in themselves. Okay, good, very good. And I think that this is really where we want to get to as we understand what it means to say that we're the poor in spirit. Well, this strange phrase means that we're impoverished, that we're lacking, and we're unable to fill that lack in ourselves. There's no hope in us. And so when we say that we're poor in spirit, we know that we are physical and spiritual. We know that God is spirit, and those who would worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. And this indicates that we're lacking in the part of ourselves that would allow us to connect with and relate to God. And so Jesus says, when you get that, I mean, everybody is lacking in our ability to come to God. But when we get that for ourselves, and we understand that, and we turn that inward to our understanding of ourselves, I cannot earn God's favor. I cannot, by my efforts, by my own goodness, by my own abilities, do what will connect me to God. I cannot obligate him. I cannot make him look at me and say, well, you know what? I really need you, John, because you're such a good guy. I need you in my heaven. So when I get the fact that I don't have the means, I don't have the ability, I don't have the moral goodness to reach the one who's the source of all and of all life and of all goodness, then I am beginning to become poor in spirit. The world is broken, and we don't have the power to fix it. I remember a few years ago, before this particular group ended up getting involved in a significant political scandal in Canadian politics, that there was a group that their theme was, and maybe different ones of you as school children were taught this theme if you were under this particular group or had this particular charity working inside of your school. Their theme was, we are the generation that we've been waiting for. And you stop and you think about the arrogance that's involved in that. We are the generation that we've been waiting for. We're the ones who can fix everything. We're finally the group that's going to get it right. Now, what ended up happening was that there was like a $910 million scandal with the Trudeau government related to this particular charity in later years. But you consider that whole issue and you think about political leaders who put themselves forward, who, we might even look at them at first and we might say, oh, well, we're hopeful about the things that they're saying and about the promises that they're making. And you think of how many times we see political leaders who they seem to start out bright and everybody's saying, finally, somebody who's going to make things better. And then there's corruption and there's downfall. And the thing that we get very clearly is that no matter how much human promise we might think that we start with, or no matter how much we might think we can do, ultimately we understand that we have nothing to offer. The poor in spirit are those who understand that no good work or no merit or no brilliance that I have to offer is going to be what is going to make what's going to save me. But we're entirely helpless and dependent. And so we come to God and we throw ourselves on his mercy as beggars and supplicants. And I'm going to stop at that point. But I want you guys to think about this from the perspective of self and meditate on this and consider what this means then practically. If I stop and I think to myself about what it means practically to be someone who in and of myself has nothing to offer to God, is never for a moment the means of my own salvation, is never for a moment the means of my becoming holy who I should be. And consider this, that we come to God entirely dependent, entirely in need of his goodness, entirely in need of his provision. And let's pray. Father, thank you for your goodness to us. And Lord, as we read your word, as we look at what Jesus Christ has to say, I pray that we would be people who, even while we look at and see the brokenness of the world and the brokenness of ourselves, we would understand that acknowledging that and being truthful about that and recognizing our helplessness is ultimately for us the only way, the only path that we can take that leads to hope, that leads to where we truly will find hope. And so we thank you for the truth that Jesus Christ spoke when he said, "Blessed are those who are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Because we understand that when we are truthful about us, we actually have tremendous hope to look forward to. A great reality that brings joy to life in the middle of 1,000 failures and 1,000 things that prove to be empty hopes. I pray that you would help us to learn from your truth, and I pray that we would live as citizens of your kingdom.